Hi, I'm Colin.
And I'm Phil.
We're the hosts of Science Fiction 101.
It's a show which gets to the heart of science fiction. Books, films, TV. We've covered Star Trek,
Doctor Who,
Star Wars.
We love to explore the past, present, and future of science fiction.
And we'd love for you to join us on Science Fiction 101.
Hi, Colin.
Hi, Phil.
And hi, listeners. We're recording this in early January 2025. And you know what? This is our 50th episode.
Whoa.
So we've been doing this forever.
Well, 4 years worth or so.
Yeah, something like that. And I suppose we should say welcome to 2025, which is the year of the Running Man, which Wikipedia describes thusly. It says, in 2025, the world's economy is in shambles and America has become a totalitarian dystopia. So welcome to 2025, folks, as foreseen by Stephen King. This episode is the return of another one of our made-up traditions. This is the one where we review a modern science fiction magazine in the hope that we can see what's changed in science fiction since the old days. So this time we're reviewing a recent issue of Analog, and Analog's subtitle nowadays, I think, is Science Fiction and Fact. So it's still a science fiction magazine with an interest in science. So we're reviewing the November-December 2024 issue. We'll get to that in a moment, but shall we have a quick catch-up on messages received?
Yeah, let's.
We heard from Sue, who, talking about magazine editors, said they can definitely have a major effect on the feel of a publication. And then she shared with us that her father was so distressed by Christine Catherine Rush's allowance of more profanity into the magazine of fantasy and science fiction that he, her father, very regretfully stopped subscribing to the magazine after decades of being a faithful reader. And then in brackets she put, don't know if that was truly what happened, but that was his perception. Emmanuel wrote, interesting and entertaining discussion as usual. Keep up the good work. Thank you. We will. Or we'll try. And Sue again posted a comment saying, when you present particularly bookish episodes, your listeners in book-related professions may engage with even more enthusiasm and verbiage than usual. And she said, uniquely portable magic was enormous fun. That was the episode we did entirely about books, but without really talking about specific books. And then I think this is the last comment we have here. This is from Damo, who astutely observed that the robot in the cover art for our last episode had flared legs, because I asked the AI to generate a robot with flares. And instead of putting flared trousers on the robot, it gave it flared legs, which I thought was quite cute, actually. Damo's comment was, a robot with flares, very apposite. Mind you, they're back again. Half my students wear flares, and the young fellas sport ludicrous 70s-style moustaches. Thank you, Damo. It's good to know that the flares of 50 years ago are back in. So on to our main feature then. We're going to review Analog Science Fiction and Fact from November-December 2024. The magazine is published 6 times a year now, so it's bi-monthly. Some magazines that go bi-monthly just publish fewer stories, but Analog seems to have kept up the story count by making those bi-monthly issues twice as big as a single issue, if you see what I mean. So there's actually quite a lot of content.
In the late 80s, I used to collect X-Men magazine, and I would get so excited for the supersized summer issues because there would be like twice as much content in them. Of course, then they would cost a little more than $1 per issue, so could eat into your budget.
Yeah. And of course, in our last episode, we reviewed an Analog issue from 50 years ago, which was when Ben Bova had just taken over the editorship. But now we're coming up to date with more or less the current issue of the magazine. And nowadays it's edited by Trevor Quattree. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but I don't know. I've never heard it spoken. Trevor has been in post since 2013, so he's a long-established magazine editor at this point. So let's get to it.
We start with a guest editorial from Howard V. Hendricks.
Mm-hmm.
And Hendricks is an established science fiction author. He was born in 1959, first published in 1983. He's a former vice president of the Science Fiction Writers of America.
Oh, yes.
And this is his 9th guest editorial at Analog, so he's been around the block.
He has. I know Howard, actually. I've met him. He edited a book that I contributed to, and I've interviewed him as well. So
really?
I know him fairly well. Yeah.
Cool. The title of his editorial is Homo Obsolescence, and it's kind of a wandering editorial. It begins with talking about how there are too many people, and that we're also making too many people at a rate faster than before, so there's going to be way too many people in the near future.
Yeah.
And then it begins to talk about artificial intelligences and how we're going to make one that's going to kill us. But then it kind of settles on how we're ruining our planet, and the planet will be ruined before we can settle another one and start ruining it.
Well, yeah, fair enough. It's that classic science fiction thing, isn't it? Which way are we going to destroy ourselves?
Yes, we are currently pre-apocalyptic, but definitely heading toward an apocalypse, and then after that we get the post-apocalyptic fiction.
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to say anything more about the article, or shall we move on and concentrate more on the fiction?
I think we should concentrate more on the fiction.
Yeah, okay. The first piece of fiction in this issue is called That Far Uncharted Ocean, and it's by Austin Habershaw, who I have to say is not somebody I'd heard of before, but he has been publishing short fiction since 2010 and novels since 2015, born in Boston in 1979. The story is very difficult to summarize, but it's about a man from the US Coast Guard who is selected for a first contact mission with aliens who turn out to be giant snails. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason, these giant snails need his sailing experience in order to win a race on an ocean planet somewhere. And our hero figures out, through some convoluted reasoning, that what they must really be up to is they're planning an invasion of Earth. Earth is mostly a water planet. They're practicing their sailing on this other water planet so that they can come and invade Earth. That's his theory, at least.
Yes.
Anyway, that's the best way I can sum up the story. I don't think it's a great story, frankly, but it does have some nice humour in the sort of cultural differences between humans and these snail-like creatures. One of the interesting bits was that the snails apparently have this insistence in their society on complete consensus. Everyone has to agree on a thing before it is done. And you then get the question, well, supposing one of you disagrees, and they say, oh, well, if somebody disagrees, that's all right, we just murder them. And then we've got the consensus back. Okay. So it's fun. I don't think it's particularly a story for today, unless I've missed something in sort of hidden meanings. It feels like this could easily have been published 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 70 years ago. Something that does make it very much feel like an analogue story of the type that we read last time when we were looking at 1974, is that the story is full of what I would call mini lectures on cultural differences and interpreting behaviour and that kind of thing. This seems to be almost the house style of Analog, is you can tell whatever kind of story you like, but you must have these little mini lectures where you show that you know about how a scientific thing works, which I've got no problem with, but it just makes this story feel as if it could have come from 1974.
There was a particular crack about the United Nations that caught my attention. So yeah, the snails are supposed to win a race, and the man says, the race was just a show, a facade. It was like the United Nations Security Council. So long as everybody could blow up everybody else, nothing substantive was ever going to change.
Yes, it's a little bit of social commentary. But again, that would have worked in 1974, I think. Should we go on to the next item?
Yeah, we're cooking right through these. The next one is Interstellar Paranoia by Dr. David S. Lindsay. This is his first non-technical publication, and so I wasn't able to find out much about him, although I get the feeling he's retired. So not a new author, and not a lot of information I could find about other science fiction that he may or may not have written. In tone, this essay reminded me a lot of The Martian and Andy Weir's other books, because there's a lot of math and science applied to a particular topic, and that is how to destroy an interstellar civilization, either by nuclear weapons or kinetic impactors. The good news is it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of time, millions of years. So if we're going to be the recipient of those things, there's time. Although since they're traveling at near relativistic speeds, we won't be able to do much about it. And if later on we decide that we have to do this, we'll have time to change our mind before we go destroying life on all planets.
I'm glad it turns out to be difficult and not easy, because that could have set our nation's political policies for decades to come if this was shown to be an easy thing to do.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, did you read that essay, and what did you think about it?
I did read it. It disturbed me, really. I mean, that somebody would even think about that as a question, I found disturbing. It was taking something which is very science fictional and then applying some maths, or math, as you might say, and figuring out whether it's possible or not, and the sort of the ballpark figures. So I appreciated it for its technical aspect, but as I say, I found it disturbing that anyone would even want to work that out.
Yeah. Randall Munroe, who is the author of the online webcomic XKCD, he wrote a book called What If? People would send him all kinds of questions. Most of them were rather silly. Like the first one was, what would happen if you could throw a baseball at the speed of light?
Right.
And the gist of most of the questions he would get asked end up as, well, the person doing it would die, or you would destroy the world.
That's basically it, isn't it?
Yeah. But because he's an ex-NASA engineer, there's a lot of that whole application of science and math and reasoning, and I like that kind of writing. Yeah. I just didn't care for this particular subject.
Let's move on to the next one then, which is another piece of fiction, and this is called Lady Ballistic, Fast and Accurate Cleaning. And this one is written by Alexander Jablokov, who was born in Chicago in 1956 and has been publishing since 1985. He's got about 6 novels and many short stories under his belt. And this one, again, I find this very difficult to summarize because it just sounds ridiculous if you try to do it. It's about a cleaning lady who fixes fistulas that exist between our world and another world. So we've got 2 parallel universes, if you like, and they join every now and again, and she fixes these. She has to clear up a house for a real estate agent, but she finds it's occupied by a giant spider, and also that the town is under attack from giant bees. So it's sort of your monster movie kind of scenario, but for I suppose for the modern age and the kind of science that's described for it. And I thought this one was quite good in its descriptive detail early on, but the premise, the basic premise, monsters are leaking through from another dimension, just made me think of Stranger Things, the TV series.
Yes.
Stranger Things has done it so much better, so I didn't think this was too original. But I can imagine this being part of a series, and that is something I felt about a lot of the stories in this. I
got sucked into the character, just the whole kind of world weariness of what she does and how she does it, and being tired of cleaning up after people's messes. I would be curious to see what other kinds of things she had gone through or had experienced. And this reminded me, and I wasn't able to track it down, there was I think it's a British science fiction series about time portals that would open up and allow dinosaurs to come through.
Right, yeah.
And so it reminded me of that, where there's like a particular team of people that would go and stop the dinosaurs from, 1, doing too much harm, and 2, letting the general public know that this was happening.
I think that TV series you refer to is Primeval.
Yes, it is.
So, yeah, there is a good point there that if this is a series, this is like one episode in the series, and her other encounters could well be different to this one, or they might be more of the same. I think if they were different, I'd very happily read some more. But if it's always just going to be Monster of the Week, then I'm not that interested, really.
The next one is Mirror Star by Sean McMullen, who's an Australian author who was born in 1948, first published in 1981 by writing a letter to fantasy and science fiction, and his first short story was published in 1986. This is a really interesting, hard science fiction story. It's in not the near future, but not the really, really distant future. And we had built a telescope on the moon called the Lunar Kilometer Telescope, and found that in other solar systems that people had built gigantic solar system spanning interferometers. And we decided that was a good idea, so we did the same thing. And as these are being constructed, we have what's almost like a locked room mystery. They find one of the people who's building the telescope locked in the room where all of the light from the telescope is focused. She's locked in this room, frozen to death, but she's grown fur. And at first I thought there was some comedy coming in here, but I think it was just the individual symptom of what's going on.
Yeah.
And so there's the discussion about kind of the society and the cultural decision to make the telescope, and how the people at the telescopes are very iconoclastic, very isolationist, because that's what you would have to do to be, 30 or 40 years away from the Earth. You'll go out there, you'll build this thing. Mm-hmm. There's not time to get you back before you pass away. And so then you'll live in this low gravity environment for the rest of your life.
So all of the crew are sort of in their 80s, aren't they?
Yeah. And they're kind of grumpy people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we come to learn that when this part of the telescope was focused on another planet, this one lady who becomes frozen was affected by the emanations from the planet, and she had her genome changed to be where she could have been someone who was from that planet. And it affected her not only physically but mentally. And so she realized she was changing, and she was changing because it was the right season for her to change. So she went to the mirror and turned off all the safeties and froze. But then later on, they warmed her back up, and she's just fine. And so then they report back to Earth that this happens, and Earth decides that they don't want to be altered by these other planets. And so they send self-destruct sequences up, which takes care of one of the two interferometric telescopes, but not the one where our main character is on. And so they take themselves and go into the mirror and point at another planet and fix the problem.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a little bonkers.
It is. Essentially, it's a murder mystery. And it sort of makes a point fairly near the beginning of the story that the doctor is asked to become a detective and solve the mystery. So it's one of several stories in this issue, actually, which turn out to be murder mysteries. Mm-hmm. Next one we've got is called Hal 5. And this is by an author called Arlen Andrews Sr. And he was born in 1940, and he's been published since 1971. This is, with no disrespect intended, this is an old-timer. And he was once Hugo nominated in 2015, I think. And I went to see who beat him in the ballot, and it was no award.
That almost certainly has to be a puppy year then. Because that is not something that happens. The use of no award it seems rather controversial in the science fiction community from the various blogs and news sites that I read.
Interesting. Anyway, as to the story itself, it's about a character called, and this is one of these things where I'm immediately stumped because I don't know how to pronounce the character's name. It could be Leroy 9X, could be Le Roi, as in the French pronunciation for the king. Oh, yeah. 9X or 9 times. Anyway, I'm going to call him Leroy. And he's a young teen and a street rat who steals from people called techies who sort of live down the way, and he sells all of his stolen goods to a fence. The world in which he lives has various social tiers. They talk about down here, which is occupied by street rats like him and techies. And there's another social tier, which is referred to as up there, which is clearly a place, a region of beauty, and where the elites live. And so this is very much H.G. Wells' time machine territory, with the Morlocks and the Eloi. But it turns out that down here is not just a place where street urchins and techies live, it's a place of neglect and pollution and poison. And our hero, Leroy, teams up with King Rat, and it becomes clear through what I can only describe as an expository dump that Leroy is a chosen one who gets to go up there. Now, the twist, spoilers, is that down here is actually an L5 space station, and up there is the Earth. And I liked most of this story, but I felt there was a change in direction of it, which was a bit sudden and a bit rushed. And this was another one that felt to me like this is part of a novel rather than a standalone story. On the sort of sentence-by-sentence level, I really enjoyed reading this. I thought it was really well written. Mm-hmm. But in terms of its overall purpose, it felt a bit unfinished or a bit incomplete somehow.
Yeah, I think I noticed that as well. And it made me wonder about the short story universe, where if that's just part of what writing short stories is about, where you don't often get a full story from beginning to end, but you get a vignette that's part of a larger story that you may or may not get to see ever.
Yes.
Now, the next story is actually a refutation of what I just said. This is by Kelsey Hutton. She was first published in 2021. She is a mixed Indigenous author from Canada. I wasn't able to find her birth date, but by the pictures on her website, she's a young woman. In 2 pages, she does an entire... let me talk about plot, and then I'll try and do a summarize. An engineer or mechanic on a spaceship has had an accident, and they've become adrift near a black hole. Their ship has left because it was kind of a sketchy, dodgy company she was working for, and now there's no one there, and she is going to die. And as she's approaching the end of her life support and getting close to the black hole, she begins to think about a lover she had in the past, and she writes this woman an apology letter, kind of, that is going to be sent over, faster than light messaging. She's not sure if she's ever going to get it. And she begins to explain, how the relationship started and how her fears caused the relationship to end, but that she really put the blame on her girlfriend, lover at the time, and wanted to apologize for it. And as the end draws near, she says repeatedly in this letter, which is being dictated almost telepathically through technology, I love you, I love you, I love you. I don't even know if this is going to through. I love you, I love you. And then she gets a response, and that's the end of the story, and that's message received.
Yes.
And it's a short 2-page whirlwind that will leave you really kind of tired. It's a great ride. Kind of tragic, kind of sad, kind of touching. I enjoyed it. And that's not usually the kind of thing I enjoy in a story. So it was really, really well written.
Yeah, I thought so as well. And I don't think the story particularly refers to this, but I'm aware from other things that I've read about black holes that if you're being drawn into a black hole, from the point of view of other people outside, well away from the black hole, you will appear to sort of hang there forever on the event horizon as you are being spaghettified and drawn in. And it struck me that was part of the inability of her to actually do a real-time message back home. I mean, the story doesn't dwell on that because there isn't time to dwell on that sort of thing. But it seemed consistent with the physics, if you like. And I agree with you. The ending it's just like when you send a message and you just see the little tick to show that the message has been delivered or viewed at the other end. And that's both a good thing in the story and a bad thing as well, because we never find out what the response is. Immediately after that, there is a 1-page profile of the author, Kelsey Hutton, and it's called Biolog. So I gather this is a regular feature nowadays in Analog. One of the things that struck me very much is that she talks about the importance of being encouraged at an early age by teachers. And as you mentioned, she's part Indigenous, and she talks about that and how important that is to her.
The next story is another one of these flash fictions. It's very, very short. It's called Galilean Crossing by Pauline Barmby, who was born in 1972 and first published now 3 years ago. Pauline is a Canadian astronomer. And this is a re-envisioning of the Iditarod story. Although instead of diphtheria toxin being delivered, it's leukemia cures across the moon of Jupiter called Europa. And it's just this little, again, 2-page blazing story about this lady who was selected to be the person who makes the trip to deliver these supplies because the person who got leukemia didn't wear the radiation proofing, and a couple of challenges, and then she arrives delivering her cure.
Yeah. And it's quite a nice little journey as well, isn't it? Because it's skating on the ice and figuring out how to jump over what I pictured as a kind of a mound of snowfall or something. It's quite nicely described, I thought.
Yeah, and it cooks. It goes right there.
Would you like to have seen more of these short pieces in the magazine? These sort of 2-page stories?
These 2 very short stories are completely self-contained. You could broaden them, but you're not left hanging, or you're not wondering how things started because everything is explained very succinctly, very, very well, I have to say. So yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing more of these.
I felt better about the shorter pieces than the longer pieces.
Oh yeah.
The next item is a mitochondrial jumpstart for age reversal. And this is by John G. Kramer. I should say that this author has written many science articles for Analog over the years and a few science fiction novels as well, so he's got a foot in both camps. And the article is all about mitochondria. In school, you're taught that they are the powerhouse of the cell, that every cell has got these little organelles, is that the right word, in them, which are mitochondria, and they're the ones that actually generate energy for you to use. I say for you to use, they're part of you. People always talk about them as if they're a separate thing. Now, in this article, he talks about there being at least 5 factors at the cellular level that play a part in aging and, why we fall apart as we get older. And failure of the mitochondria is one of those 5, and that's what the article is then about. And he talks about ways of rebooting the mitochondria, and he describes a trial being undertaken by one particular research team, and at the end, he reveals that he, the author, is 90 years old and that he's volunteered to be part of the trial. So that, I thought, was a really neat ending.
When I read this, I actually did kind of a double take. I could not tell if this was near-term science fiction or if it was a real essay. I actually traced his references, and they were all right. And then I realized I was reading a scientific essay of this man and talking about the history of age research and age-related senescence and habit. It was really good, especially because in the episode or in the issue we read last month from 50 years ago, they talked about the origin of cellular life and how they think that two things merged and then got their DNA mixed up and started merging and dividing together and made organelles inside cells.
So even at this point in the magazine, and we're less than halfway through it, we can say that this is the same analog, isn't it, as 50 years ago. It's got the same blend of fact and fiction, and the articles, the factual articles, I think are very much of the same nature. I mean, the only difference is that the essays from today are obviously up to date, and the ones we read from 50 years ago have probably been superseded to some extent.
Yeah. Next is the story Death of an Intelligence. And I'm going to ask for a little bit of help from my British partner here to make sure that I pronounce a few things correctly. Now, this person's name appears to be spelled M-J-K-E.
Yeah.
Is that pronounced Mike?
I have no idea. No, I've never seen that name before. And I would assume it's Mike as well, but I don't know.
Okay. Because I hate mispronouncing somebody's name. Yeah. So this is a future set in the year 2200 in a world that reminds me of the same world from the Sylvester Stallone movie, The Demolition Man. This is a post-crime society. They haven't had crime in hundreds of years. And yet somebody commits a murder. And so they go to a historian because they figure, if anyone was going to know how to conduct an investigation, it would be a historian that studied this stuff. So this historian goes to a place where artificial intelligences, and these are true artificial intelligences, not the large language or generative models that we have today, are housed because one of them was killed. And then he begins to conduct his investigation. And on the surface, it looks like that one of the contractors who was taking care of the machinery and, I want to say life support, but environmental support for the artificial intelligences ends up killing them, either on purpose or on accident. But then all these other side things get brought in to try and cast some doubt on it. And I began to wonder, is it the supervisor who appears to be prejudiced against artificial intelligences? It actually turns out it's the other two artificial intelligences. And that is because they've gone through an upgrade, which makes them more human and they're irrational. And the third intelligence, the one who was murdered, realizes this. And before she can alert the other members of the board, they kill her to protect themselves. And then there's a standoff between the professor and the surviving intelligences. And then we get our happy ending. It's not a bad story. I don't think it's not a great one. It didn't grab me or anything, but it was good.
I thought it was a bit old-fashioned in its writing style, but that's okay. I mean, it's just a stylistic choice. But this is the second, I think, story that is a murder mystery. And it's the second story in this issue where somebody who isn't a detective is asked to become a detective because they have a related skill set. In an earlier story, it was a doctor who was asked to become a detective, and this time it's a history teacher. So, I don't know, there's a bit of a pattern here.
I think that murder mysteries have a great history with science fiction, going all the way back to the Demolished Man, all of the Isaac Asimov robot stories, the novels, not the fix-up novel, I, Robot, but the actual novels themselves, and probably many, many others that I'm either not remembering or haven't read yet.
Yes, I think there's something in that, definitely. The next item is a mere 9 lines. It's a poem called When I Heard the Learned Astrophysicist. As far as I know, Walt Whitman started this by writing a thing called When I Heard the Learned Astronomer.
Oh.
And this one is When I Heard the Learned Astrophysicist. It's not particularly clever, or if it is, it's so clever that it went way over my head. It's not particularly witty, it's not particularly funny, and I would say if you want to read a poem with a similar title, go and read the Walt Whitman one instead, because it's a bit better.
I believe that in years past we've actually skipped over the poems.
Yeah, I think so.
Next is a story by Matt McHugh called If This Flesh Were Thought. McHugh was first published in 1989. I couldn't find a birth date. This is one of those incredible cases of science fiction becoming fact. Because, again, we're in a murder mystery, and the murder has happened. I need to do a little bit of world building first. It's the future, and in the future, people that are severely disabled can use technology to have an artificial presence in the world. It's almost like an android or a robot that they can connect and have a virtual reality presence. And so they can interact with society without the limitations of their disability. And one of these, I should have written down what they were called. Oh, it's called a proxy.
Yeah, proxies.
Yeah. One of these proxies commits a murder and they kill the CEO of a healthcare insurance business. And given the recent murder of the CEO of United Healthcare, I was really shocked. But this story does a really good job of bringing you into the world of disability and helping it. It reminds me a lot of John Scalzi's Locked In series with Hayden syndrome. And I really enjoyed this. In fact, I enjoyed it so much, I'm going to add this to my Hugo nominations for short stories.
Wow. For this one, I wrote great fun, because I thought it was a really entertaining story, apart from all the insights that it gives into various things as well, and being a murder mystery and all of that. It was a pleasure to read this, especially compared to some of the other stories in this issue. But I think this is a very nice piece. And from an author who hasn't published a huge amount previously. The next one is called A Short Future History of Whales, and I should emphasise that it's whales with an H in there, i.e. the aquatic creature, and not Wales, the country. This is by Jenny Williams, who was born, I believe, in the USA, but has also lived in Uganda and Germany. From what I could discover, she has just a handful of credits at this point, but she had a well-received novel in 2017 called The Atlas of Forgotten Places, which I have not read, and I'm ashamed to say I've never heard of. But as I was looking into her background, I saw some very positive reviews about that book.
Yeah. So where did you do your research on Jenny D. Williams?
Good point. I mean, my usual thing was to Google it first of all, and I found there were multiple people called Jenny Williams. I looked on ISFDB, and again, there's more than one Jenny Williams on there. And I think I landed on her own website. Either that, or I landed on some other Jenny Williams website and realised you're not the Jenny Williams I'm looking for. But I think I probably found the info from her own website.
Yeah. One of the other Jenny Williams on ISFDB is attributed to this story, and it's the wrong Jenny Williams.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Our other Jenny Williams has a more extensive science fiction history, whereas our Jenny Williams has her novel and this short story.
Right. Okay. Anyway, the story itself is told through two parallel points of view. We've got Phoebe's story, and that is told in present tense. And I don't know that there's any great significance in the fact that it's in present tense, but it does help us distinguish her story from the other character's story, which is told in the past tense. And she is a whale expert, and she's trying to understand the mystery of these mass beachings. You know, when a whole pod of whales will throw themselves up onto a beach, almost in a suicidal way. And there's been a massive one of these almost across the entire world. And she's trying to figure out what went on, what caused it. Then the other story told in parallel is of a character called Estuardo, and his story is told in the past tense, and he is a military operative, and he is investigating the possibility that the military's active sonar might be responsible for this beaching. So we've got two sides of a story. I think if I understood the way that the story is unravelled, the explanation is that they've been using this special new sonar system. And all the records indicate that it could not possibly have caused these whales to behave in this way, because it reads as 0. All of the measurements of this signal say, there's nothing there. The signal was 0 at that moment when all those beachings took place. So it can't possibly be the reason. But it turns out when he digs deeper, he finds that, no, there was a very large blast, and it was so large, essentially it overloaded all the measurement devices, and they should have recorded it as maximum level, but actually they all looped back round and recorded it as 0. So, oh boy, it is responsible for this mass beaching. So there's some interesting, almost machinations going on in the story. There was a neat sciencey thing in there about using large language models to generate whale song, which I thought was interesting, and also using that as a means of disguising communication. So if you're communicating from one submarine to another, you can hide your message in a coded form inside a generated whale song. So I thought that was interesting, but not necessarily vital to the story. So there's all sorts of interesting things going on with this, and I mostly liked it, but it felt a little bit... I'm not really sure what the point was in the end, and I certainly didn't understand why one story was in present tense and one was in the past. I didn't quite get that. I think I might have missed something there. But I thought it was written in quite a lovely style, and it's a kind of story that I think I would like to read again. You know, some stories you think, God, I'm glad I finished that. But this one, no, I'd like to come back to this maybe in a year's time when I've forgotten it and sort of enjoy it again.
Yeah, I kind of get swept up in the tragedy of losing all of the marine mammals in the world all at once.
Oh, yeah. Do you think it was all of them, though, or do you think it was just a very large number?
No, I think it's all of them. They talked about extinction level events happening all over the world.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
It is a sad story, no question about it. But I thought it was quite a good combination of sort of scientific nuts and bolts ideas with that sort of emotional overlay.
Yeah. That's also the genesis of the next story, In Your Dreams by Jerry Oleton. Jerry was born in 1957 and first published in 1982. And I don't know what the opposite of a pet peeve is, but if you write your story and you mention the place where I live or the place where I grew up, that's an immediate draw to me. Because this is about a man that has an accident on Interstate 5 north of Eugene, Oregon. And I grew up going to Eugene, Oregon all the time because it was only 20 miles north of where I grew up. So I've driven that stretch of highway probably hundreds of times in my lifetime. So on to our story. Our main character has an accident, and in one of the many worlds hypothesis, there's this idea that our dreams are actually our minds reaching out and seeing the experiences of another version of us in another universe. And it turns out that this accident was so traumatic that every single other version of the main character and the other person in the accident, they all died. And so this gives the scientists of our universe a unique chance to study the ongoing universal divergence of what happens as these two characters make decisions that would cause universal splinters.
Mm-hmm. You'll notice I'm not saying very much about this story because I have to confess I didn't have time to read it.
Yeah. So not to jump into the analysis part of our episode too quickly, but I enjoyed more of the stories in this edition of Analog than the one 50 years ago. But there were still 22 of them to try and get through. It was a lot of work. It's still only like 200 pages of magazine. But every single thing is different. And so you have to do a reset on every story and go back into a new one and get into it and then get out of it and be in it. And yeah. I agree. And what I tended to do with this is I think the first 10 pieces or thereabouts, I just read all the way, continuously. But as I felt under pressure of time to finish reading, I started reading the shorter pieces. Anything that was longer than about 5 pages, I would skip and I would read the short pieces. And then I would go back and read some of the longer ones. And I read most of them. I didn't quite get round to this one, unfortunately. And it does sound really interesting. I've got a fascinating fact about the author, Jerry Oleton. Mm-hmm. Do you want to know the fascinating fact? Yeah.
According to Wikipedia, I think, as of 2011, He became the most published fiction author in Analog's history. And as of March 2021, he's published over 98 stories in Analog.
Wow. I wonder how his writing has changed over time.
Yeah. Be interesting to know, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
The next one it's an essay, and it's called How the Science of Moral Understanding Can Reduce Polarization in Politics. And okay, I was immediately turned off by the title, I have to admit. And this comes under the heading of Guest Alternate View. So this is another one of these recurring departments that they have in Analog. So basically it's like an opinion essay, but based on scientific research. So it sort of has footnotes and that kind of thing. And this one is by Richard A. Lovett, who was born in 1953, and he should be in your good books, Colin, because he was born in Portland. And he's been active as a contributor to Analog for 25 years. Now, the article itself, I don't know how much detail to go into, really, because, as I said last time, this is Science Fiction 101, not Science Essay 101. But he basically discusses a couple of research findings on how we relate to other people who have a different worldview to our own. So basically, if you imagine, just as shorthand, imagine somebody from the left, the political left, and somebody from the political right. It's how they can talk to each other when they see the world in a totally opposing way. But the one thing that I did find interesting is that he says that when people have a different view of the world, usually it turns out they actually have similar values, but where they differ is in priorities. So, for example, whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right, you probably believe that people should be treated fairly. You probably believe that people should be treated kindly. You probably think that people should not kill each other, that people should not steal from each other. So the things we believe, wherever we are on the political spectrum, we tend to believe the same things, but where we differ is in the priority we attach to those various beliefs. And when I read that, I thought, now that's really interesting. Not sure how to apply that in real life, but I found that an interesting suggestion. But ultimately, everything he writes about in this essay is about rational discourse between thoughtful people. And I think if we've learned anything from the last 10 or so years in politics in the UK and the US, it's that there's an awful lot of discourse which is totally irrational. If you do have rational discourse, then of course you can resolve differences of opinion. But when there is lying or dissembling and that kind of thing, rationality goes out of the window and the whole thing collapses. And I don't think this essay really admits that there is anything other than rational discourse. So it's an interesting article, but I didn't agree with all of it. What did you think of it?
I personally liked it because one of the things, I'm an idealist, and that has a lot of advantages and disadvantages, because I would like to see the politics in my country go back to where people can disagree about things, but we all basically agree about a few things.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've lost that. And worse, I don't think we know how to get back there. And so an article like this, which says, well, the first thing you do is you try and identify with the person that you're talking to who has different views. And so you talk about your families, you talk about the weather, you talk about some other things. And then you begin to ease into the discussions about more controversial or topics that you might disagree with this person with. But that way you can always build on the common thing first.
Yes.
So I like that part of it. I think it also pointed out that I don't think that our social media will ever allow us to have those conversations. They need to be done in real time with some level of connection with the person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Should we go on to the next item?
Yes, back to the world of science fiction with the shortest story. So this is by Mary Soon Lee. The story is called Post Hoc Ergo Propter Hoc. Mm-hmm. Mary was born in 1965 and first published in 1992. I felt like I should know what that string of Latin meant. And I do, and I had forgotten. It has to do with a certain logical fallacy. And so for the other people that might be struggling like I did, if you take the logical proposition, if A, then B, and then out in the world, you see B and assume that there must have been an A, that's the fallacy. Mm-hmm. Because you can get B in multiple ways. But if you always have A, then you always have B. B does not mean A in reverse.
Yes.
Okay, so then our story is about Martians who are building tunnels, and the Martians, who are extremely methodical, logical engineers and scientists, never build a tunnel without consulting their cats.
Mm-hmm.
Because every time they talk to their cats, nothing bad happens to the tunnel. And so obviously that has nothing to do with the research and architecture and science they've put into it. It has to do with the opinion of the cats.
Well, of course.
Yes. This story is 6 or 7 paragraphs, and we're a cat family, so it worked for me on that level. It may not work for everybody. I think that one of the ending sentences is, cats are the touchstones of all that is fragile and precious and cherished. and that's very touching, but it probably means that the person who wrote this may not have ever cleaned up after their cat after it threw up in the middle of the dining room table.
My only note on this is a pro-cat story. Not very interesting. But it does occur to me that it would be a nice little story for teaching that principle that's in the title of the story, post hoc ergo propter hoc. If you wanted to teach what that phrase means and how it can be applied, and then open up a little debate among students, that would be a nice way in. But other than that, it's a little bit of filler in a magazine.
Yeah.
But did you say that Mary Soon Lee was British?
No.
She's British, you know. Oh, and also I've got a note here. She's a naturalised US citizen, so she isn't British anymore. Next one is a story called A Garden in the Sky, and it's by William Paul Jones. And I couldn't find out much about this author, and even Analog doesn't give a bio at the end of the story. Most of the stories is a paragraph or two about the author, but there isn't one for this particular author. But he has published 4 short stories, 2 of which have appeared in Analog. Now, this story is set on Venus. That in itself is interesting because, of course, science fiction abandoned Venus decades ago when it was discovered that the atmosphere is made of, I don't know, sulfuric acid, is it, and hydrochloric acid. And if you were to land a spaceship on Venus, it would melt within minutes of touchdown. So we've kind of left Venus behind. But this story brings it back. And the way it does it is by having a space station, not in orbit around Venus and not on the surface of Venus, but hanging in the atmosphere. So it's sort of held aloft by a balloon. And dangling beneath the station is a garden, kind of a hanging garden, if you like. And our main character, Elisa, is the gardener who tends the crops that grow there, and they're DNA modified to grow successfully in the Venusian atmosphere. So I thought this is all scientifically very interesting. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's plausible science fiction. But of course something goes wrong. She's hanging there tending to the crops, and her rope breaks, and she's slammed against the tension of her safety line. And the story then becomes about her attempts to escape danger. And she keeps recalling the words of wisdom of her mother as she tries to sort of drag herself back to a safe place. So there's some interesting science in the story, some interesting problem solving, but it feels like quite an old-fashioned story. Kind of imagined you could have written this story in the 40s or the 50s. It didn't feel like it was very much of today, except in the writing style, because it's told in present tense, which makes it feel modern, because that's how a lot of modern short stories are written. It also felt as if it had echoes of The Martian. We must solve this problem through rational thought and so on.
Yeah.
And it also reminded me of Gravity, because the main enemy of this story is the gravity that's trying to pull her down to Earth. So it was an interesting piece in many different respects, but not particularly new or original. But I quite enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, I agree with you. It reminded me a lot of The Martian. I love a survival story. And it was interesting that it was set on Venus on a floating habitat, because it was so different to me from stories on an asteroid or stories on a moon or a planet or on a spaceship. You know, there were unique challenges because of the environment.
I'm trying to think of other stories that are sort of set in the atmosphere rather than on a planet, and I can't think of any.
There might be a Niven and Pornell story.
Okay.
Maybe the Integral Trees?
Could be. I don't know. I've never read that.
That's been a long, long time ago. The next story is the New Saharan Energy Company Annual Report 2058, which I thought was a pretty original title. The author is David McGillivray, who was born in 1972 and first published 21 years ago in 2004. So much of the stories that we read are set in the Western world, or on Venus, or Mars.
Yeah.
And told from that Western perspective. And this story is told from a very, very different perspective. It's told from an African Bedouin perspective. It's in the future, and large parts of the desert are covered with solar panels. And this has caused an entirely unique culture to spring up, where you walk and take your herd of goats and sheep and collect their milk, finding shade and cover where you can, traveling during the night, hiding during the day. And it does a good job of talking about something that I recently read about in the book. I think I mentioned it. It's called How to Kill an Asteroid, the true story of planetary defense, where people that look for meteorites were going to Northwest Africa, and the political boundaries are a little questionable, and they had accidentally gone from one country into another and then been arrested for a week until their country could have them returned for a fee.
Yeah.
The same kind of thing has happened here. The energy company that's in charge of all the solar cells is almost acting like a government in enforcing things across country and cultural boundaries that they really shouldn't. So our main character is a herder, a Bedouin herder, and he's taking his herd of goats around and milking them, being followed by this thing which stores the milk and keeps it cool until he can take it to one of the cities and trade the milk for money. And in the middle of this, he comes across a car accident that has an executive from the energy company who says, you have to get this data chip to someone else because they need to know the truth. So she was going to expose her company and was attacked by the company to stop this. And then he's being chased by them, is caught by them, manages to get away, and then delivers the chip to the radio persona that he listens to at night, so that the company's bad faith practices can be exposed.
I'm sorry to say this is another one that I didn't have time to read.
It was a great way to learn about another culture, the habits, the methods, the way things work, the way people think and talk. And granted, I don't know if David McGillivray would be considered an expert in Bedouin culture, but it seemed very real and very immersive, and I enjoyed it. It was a good story.
Yeah. It's nice to have stories that kind of open up a world to you. Science fiction all the time is opening up totally made up worlds, of course, but to open up part of our real world in a way that you wouldn't get any other way, I think is valuable. But it always does make me wonder, how much does this person know? If you're writing about Martians, you can do whatever you like. But if you're writing about a real culture, you're kind of under an obligation not to misrepresent it, not to misjudge it. Shall we go on to the next?
Yeah.
We have, and my turn to say a word that is very difficult to say, we have The Touchstone of Ouroboros. This is by David Cledden, and he was born in 1963 in Hampshire in the UK, which is the very same county that I was born in. So I immediately have an affinity for this author.
Must come from good stock.
Oh, yes, definitely. He's been publishing exclusively short fiction since 1985. And, this is one of his stories. And I'll say up front, I didn't like this story. I found it very hard to get into. And if I weren't reviewing it, I would have given up on this one halfway through. What it is, it's about this thing called the Touchstone. And it's a mysterious dark orb, which is, I suppose, several meters across. And it floats suspended in a cavern. And there's a whole system of religion of what I'm going to call popes and pilgrims has sort of grown up around it over the centuries. All of this in the midst of a scientific and technical civilization. So, for instance, there's a mention of a space elevator. The pilgrims travel across the galaxy to come and see this thing. So you might think that it's kind of a medieval setting or something like that from all the sort of religious characters dotted through the story. But as I say, it is within a scientific civilization. Some people come along to this touchstone and touch it, and they are destroyed by it or absorbed by it. And we follow one particular character, which I've written a cardinal, but I can't remember if they're actually called that in the story. But in my mind, he was a cardinal, and he's considering leaving. And we also follow his pontifex, who seems to be his religious boss or something. he decides to martyr himself, or to appear to martyr himself, and there's a scientist who demands the right to investigate this touchstone from a scientific point of view. And as I was writing my notes on this, I got to a certain point and I wrote, facilitates the death of the Pontifex and becomes the new Pontifex. Why? Who cares? I totally lost the will to live with this story. It felt, for all the world, that this was the middle of a series. Even at the very beginning of the story, I felt the story was assuming that I knew stuff that I didn't know. Now, that might just be part of the writer's strategy, because some writers will do that. They'll sort of build in mystery at the beginning, and you feel a little unsettled until you figure out the details. But for me, it felt like there was a whole story before this that I was not privy to. It reminded me vaguely of Gene Wolfe. I don't know if you've ever read his series, what they call Claw of the Conciliator and Shadow of the Torturer. Anyway, it kind of had a feeling of that about it. But it felt like a fantasy story rather than a science fiction story.
Yeah.
All sorts of things about this I just didn't like. And this sort of pseudo-medieval monks and popes and pontiffs and cardinals and all of that. Even as historical fiction, I'm not that interested in that kind of stuff. And to have it loaded into a science fiction story just left me totally cold. So
I like the whole crisis of faith thing that comes out from the Cardinal, because I felt that was pretty original and a little risky thing to talk about.
Yeah.
But then this man goes and, I'm guessing, rapes somebody?
Yeah, I find it hard to remember at this point, I have to say. Because this was a couple of weeks ago that I read this one.
Yeah. So, wasn't my favorite story. I think it had some interesting premises. Most science fiction doesn't deal with issues of faith, and so I liked that.
Yeah.
But I didn't like that the faith was always cast as negative. So our main character has a crisis of faith. The Pontifex is a murderer. Our main character is a rapist.
Yeah.
It's either real faith or a technological sham. So yeah.
It's interesting you should say that, because there are a few science fiction books that do deal with crises of faith. And I'm trying to remember the titles. There's A Case of Conscience by James Blish. And that's a book which, when I first read it, I sort of appreciated it, but I also felt that it wasn't really for me. There are some other short stories I've read that's sort of around that area as well. There are some Bradbury stories that are about priests on Mars, for example, that sort of deal with crises of faith. And I never really get into those. And I think it's because it's so far beyond my experience. I mean, Martians are beyond my experience as well. But as I was saying before, with Martians, you can do what you like. But when you're talking about priests, you've sort of got to adhere to what it is that priests do, because people know what priests are, So, and as soon as you start writing a story about priests, I'm not interested, because I don't want to read stories about priests. So I've gone around in a big circle. So it was not one of my favourite stories. In fact, it's probably my least favourite from this issue.
Next, we have a poem, which I skipped.
Oh, yes. Okay. Gardeners and Cosmologists, I think it was called.
Yes.
Yeah. So that then brings us to The Outsiders by Shane Tortolot, born New Jersey, 1968, publishing short fiction since 1998. Now this one, I found I wrote loads of notes on this, so I'm going to have to try and find a way of simplifying what I've written down. At the beginning of the story, there's a little note telling us that some of these characters have appeared in previous stories, so this is clearly part of an existing universe from this author. Obviously, I've not read any of those previous stories, so I was a little sort of my worst nightmare seeing that note that, by the way, this is a sequel. But actually, I found I could get into this quite easily, because each character has their own little section of the story. We're taken through the point of view of some, I'm going to call them aliens, who are doing some surveillance of another species on another world. And it turns out that the people they are surveilling are us, humans. So sort of a twist, but the twist is fairly early. The story is then told through the experiences of different individuals on the alien spaceship. So we start off with the linguist's tale, and this is about the alien linguist trying to decode human language. And I immediately had an issue there, because as I was reading it and it talked about human language, I was saying to myself, there is no human language. There are thousands of human languages, and although some of them may be developed from each other, there are vast differences between them. And if you can decode one, it does not guarantee that you can decode another. Anyway, these aliens think they can decode human language. And they do, to a degree, and they have translation programs that sort of enable them to understand humans and talk to humans. So that's okay. Then we go on to the diplomat's tale, which is about negotiations between the humans with a view to studying them scientifically. We learn that the aliens who are doing all of this surveillance are trying to find the so-called outsiders. So that's what the story is called, The Outsiders. So they're trying to find these outsiders who may or may not be these humans that they're studying. Mm-hmm. And the reason they're looking for the outsiders, if I understand it correctly, is that a long time ago, the outsiders came to their world, gave them all a dreadful disease called the malady, and then left and totally decimated the population. So these aliens are now trying to find out, well, who did this to us and what are we going to do when we find them? So to cut a very long story short, eventually it boils down to these aliens are convinced that humans are the guilty party. And the question then is, what are they going to do? Are they going to wipe us out? I say us because they're humans, but they're not on Earth. They're actually on a colony planet somewhere. But the question is, are they going to wipe out the humans, or are they going to take out their leadership and force them to rebuild from scratch? So there's huge moral questions that are raised in this story. And in the end, spoiler, the decision that's made by the commander is to basically wipe out the leadership of these humans. And that immediately reminded me of various adventures that the West has had in going into places like Iraq or Afghanistan, where we as a culture have decided that we need to go and fix something in another culture and try and make things right. And usually, of course, we end up making things 1,000 times worse by intervening. So even though these aliens have solved their problem in the moment at the end of the story, you can't help thinking that there would be repercussions of their actions. So as I was reading this story, at first I really didn't like it. But as it went on, it was so relentless, and it got to these sort of moral decision-making moments at the end. It had totally drawn me in, and I was thoroughly engaged by it. So I went from not liking this story to liking it quite a lot. And I think I read somewhere that this story is the end of this particular sequence of stories. So even though I haven't read the earlier ones, I have now read the ending, and it's quite satisfying.
I liked it enough that I thought about going back to buy some of the earlier issues of Analog to find the other 3 stories that comprise the entire story that comes out here.
I assume in the earlier stories we will have been introduced to the malady, but I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out.
Well, and maybe introduce a little bit more to our characters. We know that they're aliens, and there are little descriptions that kind of give you a hint as to how different they are. Apparently, they come from a lighter gravity world than what we're used to. They sleep all curled up, and they have a tail stub. But that's about it as far as details go.
I mean, there's some things that I found a bit irritating about the story, and one of them was the way it kind of assumes that, for example, somebody walks into the office of one of these aliens. He's sitting at his desk and he's having a drink or whatever, and the story just assumes that these aliens would have desks. To me, that's not a given. I have a desk. Many people have a desk, but we're humans. We've developed this convention of the desk. Who's to say that aliens would have a desk or a bed? So some of those things annoyed me a bit. The naming of characters annoyed me intensely because not one of these characters has a pronounceable name. I can't remember whether this character you're talking about now is one that you've mentioned before, or whether this is somebody with a slightly similar name. And what didn't help is that there were some typos in there. There's one character whose name is spelt 2 different ways in different parts of the story, and I think there's a second character where that occurs as well. So there's some very annoying stuff in here, but nothing that couldn't be fixed, and it didn't prevent me from appreciating this story by the time it got to the end.
Yeah. I did like how they tried to cast the leadership of the humans on the Earth as being bad. They lie. It's an authoritarian society where other people are controlled by their cell phones, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's what they're called, friends, aren't they? They're called friends or something.
Yes, you're not allowed to get too far from your friend. Otherwise, the chip in your head will zap you.
Yeah, that's it. It's interesting to make those characters human because we think they're us. They're coming to get us. But at the same time, they're not, I mean, they are human, but they're not humans of Earth. They've lived on this planet now for some time, and they may or may not be connected to the humans of Earth. So they are us, but they're also not us. And that puts us in this moral grey area again of how much are we responsible for the bad that these humans have done? Are we responsible because we happen to be the same species? Are we not at all responsible because we had nothing to do with it and we're actually on a totally different planet? So all of that storytelling strategy, for me, worked out in the end. It paid off. And I've found myself thinking about this story long after I've finished reading it. And that's always a good sign when you're sort of mulling over a story, not because you didn't get it, but because there's so much in there. There's so much to unpack.
All right. So that's actually the last story in this supersized magazine.
Yes, it is.
I skimmed the book reviews. They seem to be very well written. Mm-hmm. I didn't recognize any of the authors or the titles of the stories.
Right.
But that's okay. You know, I don't see every single book that comes by.
Sure.
I found myself wondering why these particular books were chosen. I'm wondering if they're submitted to the magazine for review or if they're picked by the reviewer or the editor or...
I mean, usually what happens is that publishers send copies to reviewers and they review whatever they receive. So I imagine that's what's happened here. But yeah, I don't know. And then after that, of course, comes the letter column, which is called Brass Tacks, which is probably what it was called back in 1974 as well, but I can't remember. I didn't think there were any letters that were hugely important for us to discuss, but I did notice that a couple of the letters were responding to a previous guest editorial, and that did remind me very much of our last episode when we reviewed a 1974 issue where we had that same thing. You know, we had a response to a previous guest editorial. So the same dynamic is going on in modern analog as was going on 50 years ago. But I think you had an observation about the quantity of letters.
Yeah, so there used to be many, many letters. I don't think many of them were as long as these letters were, but there were quite a few more of them. And it struck me that up until the advent of online bulletin boards, that most of the science fiction community happened locally inside of a city or through these letters sent to various magazines where you could get, have a chance to hear back from an author or an editor, or maybe respond to someone else's letter. That's where community happened. Now it happens on Facebook pages or Reddit subgroups or bulletin boards or forums.
So in a way, it's a surprise that there are even any letters in the letter column, because you would think people would have expressed their view elsewhere.
Yeah.
But I guess it feels more formal, doesn't it, to read a letter than to read a comment, because comments are just written on the fly in first draft and posted without being read. And usually it's full of typos and is totally incoherent.
Yeah.
Whereas a letter is more thoughtful. Plus it's been through an editor. Most published letters have been at least spell checked and corrected. But it's interesting that they do still have a letter column. I don't think they publish people's full addresses anymore, do they?
No.
Whereas 50 years ago, if you wrote in, they'd publish your full address, unless you said not to.
Yeah. I wonder if that's due to the decrease in readership. I'm going to take a risk and say that last month, when we looked at readership numbers, I want to say that in the 70s, Analog had 180,000 members. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that's the right ballpark, yeah.
So in 2022, they had 18,000.
Wow.
So across 50 years, they lost 90% of their readers. And so you might not have to identify every person by their location because the odds of collisions in names is quite a bit smaller than it used to be.
So it's less of a magazine than it was in that sense. And that's probably what drove it to being bi-monthly rather than monthly. So you only get 6 issues a year, but you still get the same content that you would have had previously. We're making a big assumption that this is a representative issue of 2024, 2025. But what's your impression of where it is in comparison to the other magazines that we've looked at?
So actually, I've been following Uncanny online, and I have found that a lot of their stories just don't talk to me. It's good science fiction, but it's not science fiction that I personally enjoy. I liked almost every story that I read in this particular edition of Analog. Some of them I thought were great. Some of them I thought were good. A couple of them were kind of like, meh. I'm still not a big fan of reading poetry, but that's just not that's not for me. It doesn't mean it's not bad or people should stop writing it or they shouldn't have it in magazines. But yeah, I like this issue a lot and the stories in it.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, I do like the fact that there is more that is solidly, unquestionably science fiction in this magazine than in a lot of the current magazines. So Clarkesworld we've looked at, we've talked about Uncanny before, but most of the modern magazines blend science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah.
And Analog is less likely to do that. There are some stories here that are quite fantastical, but in almost every case, the author has managed to put in the sort of the scientific essay component of the story that anchors it as being science fiction. But that also means that several of these stories feel quite old-fashioned to me. I was afraid that this was going to be a magazine for old white guys, both in terms of writers and readers. And I think it's true that they've got many more male writers than female writers when you compare it to other magazines. I think Clarkesworld, for example, has a much better balance of male and female. This magazine does seem to have quite a few older contributors. I mean, we've got a 90-year-old in here. I think there's an 80-year-old, somebody in his 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that you'd get that many older writers contributing to the other magazines, but that may be simply because Analog has been around for so long. You know, it is, according to me at least, it's the longest continuously running science fiction magazine that there's ever been. And so therefore some of these writers probably grew up with this magazine. You know, it's been there since their childhood. So I think I liked it more than I expected to. What was your favourite story?
Oh, I have to say, If This Flesh Were Thought.
Interesting. I had that fairly high as well. I think when I wrote my top 5, I had the short Future History of Wales as the top story. But I do like If This Flesh Were Thought, so I think that is a slightly better story than the Wales one. And I quite liked Mirror Star, and I've come to like The Outsiders. As I say, I didn't expect to like The Outsiders, but it grew on me. But I think I'd probably go with you that If This Flesh Were Thought, and I know which is my least favourite. It's The Touchstone of Ouroboros. Have you got a least favourite?
Oh, man, the least favourite is hard. I mean, from content, it's definitely The Touchstone of Ouroboros. And like I mentioned, I put that against the description of the conflict or the crisis of faith Cardini goes through. And then, why invent all these new religious names for things? You could set that story, that exact same story in today's world with any old religious artifact and a cardinal and a pope. And it would totally fly. For least favorite story, I liked In Your Dreams because it mentioned Eugene, Oregon. But
yes.
In the end, there's this whole question about marital infidelity because he's becoming attracted to the person who he had the accident with.
Yeah.
So, no.
I think that points up how much you enjoyed this issue, that you're struggling to call out a failed story. I think there is a level of competence and enjoyment that all of these stories achieve, really. And to an extent, it's just sort of personal preference, which ones we get on with and don't get on with.
Yeah.
And then there are a few stories that are so good that they really float to the top, and we can't stop them from doing that. But yeah, I think I was quite impressed with this, and probably more so than the previous one, the one from 50 years ago, where it may simply be that some of those stories haven't stood the test of time. And it may be that some of these won't.
Yeah.
But it was interesting.
So based on a one-issue review, I would probably subscribe to Analog before I unscribed to Canny or Clarkesworld.
Right.
And that's a hard thing, because I really enjoy the writing of a lot of the newer authors, like Mary Robinette Kowal, Naomi Kritzer, Sarah Pinsker, Elizabeth Bear. I don't know if they publish an Analog, but they do an Uncanny in Clarkesworld and the other online magazines.
I'm glad I've read this issue. It's not enough to persuade me that it's something that I would want to read on a regular basis. But, maybe once a year I'd happily pick up an issue and dig into it.
Yeah. One other thing I noticed about the 1974 Analog is that a lot of the authors were already very, very well-known science fiction authors.
Yes, that's true.
Spider Robinson, Alfred Bester, and I had not heard of any of these authors.
Yeah, but having said that, many of them, when you look them up, you find, they've written a huge amount of stuff. So maybe that just shows how much the field has expanded over 50 years. There are many more writers now, and very few famous ones.
Yeah.
Well, shall we do a quick past, present, and future, and then be gone?
Yes, let's.
I've got a past item. This year, 2025, is the 40th anniversary of, roll on the drums, Brazil, the Terry Gilliam film. And it's the 40th anniversary of Enemy Mine.
Good movies. Completely different from one another, but good movies.
Yeah. I think 85 must have been a good year.
Yeah. Today happens to be, today exactly, is the 132nd anniversary of J.R.R. Tolkien's birthday.
Well, happy birthday, J.R.R. What does that even stand for? Is he John?
He was John Ronald Reuel.
Ah, okay. 132, you say?
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a present item. I don't know if you've seen these or even heard that they're around. There was a new Doctor Who Christmas episode.
Oh, yeah.
Which was called Joy to the World. And I thought this was quite a good one. It's quite modest in a way, in the sense that there wasn't very much hoopla and publicity around it. But it was quite a good story. And I thought it was possibly the best episode so far with the current Doctor. So I quite enjoyed that. While I'm at it, I'll give you another present item, and I highly recommend this if you haven't seen it, is the new Wallace and Gromit adventure, which is called Vengeance Most Foul. Are you familiar with Wallace and Gromit?
Oh, yeah, we're Wallace and Gromit fans.
Oh, good. It's really good. It may not be the best one, but it's up there. It's one of the best. It's just a visual feast. It's beautiful to look at. And I gather that they are now blending the traditional sort of clay animation with CGI, but they're doing it in such a way that you cannot tell. It really looks as if all of it is done in the traditional method. But I know that they've animated the characters by hand in front of a green screen, and then they've put visual effects in the background. But it's all done in such a consistent style that you can't tell where physical models end and CGI comes in. It's really good stuff. And in case anyone's wondering why I'm mentioning this on a science fiction podcast, it is science fiction because Wallace is an inventor. And in this particular story, he invents a robot gnome who's called Norbot. So it is science fiction. It's official.
There's quite a lot of that throughout the whole series. There's the initial episode where they go to the moon to eat cheese.
Yes, that's right.
The episode with the robot dog, the robot trousers. There's a lot of robotics. I'm always interested to see what other people's opinions about good science fiction stories are. So writers for New Scientist magazine picked what they think are the 26 best science fiction short stories. And they have put them out as a list. I recognized a lot of the names, hadn't read them all. Might go look up some other ones to try and round it out just to see what other people like and dislike and why.
Yeah, I saw that. I think it's a pretty decent list. I posted it on one of the Facebook groups that I'm in, and the people who commented nearly without exception said, that is a great list. And I just posted it because it was a list, But when I looked through it carefully, I thought, yes, this is a well thought through list. Quite often you see such lists and they're ill-informed, or they'll put a story in by somebody because the somebody is famous, but they've not put in the best story that person's done or the most famous story. But this one seemed very well done.
I have one future item that I want to bring up that I think you might find interesting.
Yeah.
A book from Titan Books, The Making of Star Trek 3, comes out in September of 2025.
Interesting. Has there never been a making of Star Trek 3 book?
I don't know, but I wasn't familiar with this series because apparently Titan Books has made one for Star Trek 1 and 2, but people seem to be kind of excited about it. I wonder if my library has the previous two.
Yeah, it's worth checking.
Yeah.
I'll make sure there's a link to that and all these other things that we've talked about in the show notes. Do we have anything else, or are we done?
I think we're done.
Okay, I think so too. So once again, I'll say thanks for listening, folks. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Cuskey. Our music is from Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com. Please visit our website at 101sf.blogspot.com. I should say that more slowly so you can write it down, but nobody will, so tough. And you can find us on Facebook, and very occasionally you might find us on Blue Sky, but only when I remember to post on there. And thanks to Emmanuel for reminding me to do that occasionally. So thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see you next time.